You probably don't think about fire much. It's just there. In stoves, in streetlights, behind glass, a button, a flick, a background hum. But there was a time when fire meant everything. Warmth, food, safety, sleep. Without it, the night was longer and colder than you can imagine. In the Stone Age, if you didn't have fire, you didn't survive. Tonight, we're going back to that world, to walk in the footsteps of those who had nothing but darkness, wind, and hope that something might catch a spark. If you enjoy quiet stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now? Now, we begin. The first cold that changed everything. They didn't know it would be the last warm morning for months. The sun rose behind the hills in that slow orange way it always did. Pale light touched the frost-covered grass, making it glisten like it might still be spring. But the elders noticed first. They always did. Their eyes followed the sky more than they followed people. They noticed the way the clouds moved. Not fast, not loud, but heavy, like they were dragging something behind them. The air smelled different too. The scent of river mud and pine sap was gone, replaced by something thinner, dry, like old bones left too long in the wind. That morning, someone whispered that the birds were late in waking, and they were right. The trees were quiet. The leaves hadn't rustled all night. The people in the camp didn't talk much about it, but they knew. The signs were there. The animals had started moving differently. The deer had gone north earlier than usual, and the boars weren't rooting near the streams anymore. The fish had disappeared almost overnight, and when someone pulled an old net from the rocks to try again, it came back empty, tangled with ice. At first, the younger ones didn't take it seriously. They laughed when their fingers went numb after gathering wood, and they turned the sudden chill into a joke, daring each other to sleep without furs, boasting about how long they could stand in the river before shivering. But even they stopped laughing when one of the boys came back from the forest without a word. He'd seen something, or maybe he'd just felt something. No one asked. That night, the campfire burned a little higher than usual, and no one strayed too far from its glow. That was the beginning of the first cold that changed everything. It didn't come in one big storm. It didn't shout or shake the earth. It crept in slowly, like a breath turning colder with every hour. One morning, the earth cracked beneath their feet where it had once been soft. The water in the clay pots froze thin and sharp at the edges. The meat they kept wrapped in hides turned stiff overnight. Someone tried to chew it anyway, cracked a tooth, and didn't say anything. They just pressed their tongue against the broken edge and stared into the fire like it might fix things. There was no real warning, no single moment where someone stood up and said, "It's here." But they all felt it, in the way sleep came slower, in the way children clung to their mothers even after waking, in how the smoke from the fire no longer rose, but clung low to the ground, as if even it wanted to stay close to the heat. The old ones began rationing the dried roots without saying why. One woman quietly buried her store of wild nuts in a tree hollow and didn't tell her sister where. It wasn't selfishness, it was survival, a kind of quiet panic only the cold could create. Soon they started talking about the fire like it was a person. They said it had moods. Some nights it was strong and steady, eager to help. Other nights it fought them, smothered itself in smoke, refused to catch even when they gave it their best bark and birch scrapings. The firekeeper, a boy not yet old enough to hunt, took his role more seriously than ever. He stayed awake long after the others fell asleep, adding twigs one at a time, whispering to the flame like it could hear him. No one mocked him for it. Not now, not anymore. Each morning began colder than the last. Their breath came out in thick clouds, and it didn't fade quickly. One morning, they found frost inside the shelters. It had crept through the grass roofs, drawn thin white lines across sleeping hides, curled into the folds of blankets. A baby coughed all night and wouldn't feed. The mother just held it tighter, rocked her body side to side, and watched the fire the whole time, as if she could will it to keep burning. No one knew what else to do. Food became memory. The stories they told while huddled by the flames drifted more and more toward what used to grow, what used to run, what used to fill their bellies without effort. There was less talk of hunting, and more talk of waiting. Waiting for the thaw, waiting for something to shift, waiting for the cold to remember. It had stayed too long, but it didn't leave. It stayed, pressing in like an invisible wall, and they knew, deeply silently, that without fire they wouldn't last much longer. You couldn't just make fire when you needed it. Not then, not in that world. You had to keep it alive, like a child, like an elder, like something sacred and dying. That meant watching it through the night, shielding it from wind and rain, carrying embers in hollowed stones wrapped in moss. There were people who knew how to breathe life back into a flickering coal, how to split wood the right way, how to know if a branch would spark or smoke. These people mattered more than hunters now, more than fighters, because when the cold comes, when it really comes, it doesn't care how strong you are. It cares whether or not you have heat. That winter would become legend among them, a season they would talk about years later, long after the clan had moved on. They would say, "Do you remember the time the river froze all the way to the bottom? Or that was the year the sun never looked warm." But they would always say one thing most of all: we made it because the fire stayed with us. When darkness meant danger, the cold was only half the threat. Darkness was the other. It came earlier each night now, swallowing the sky in slow, deliberate strokes. The sun would dip below the trees before anyone was ready, and the light would disappear not just from the sky but from the faces around the fire. Even the brightest flame couldn't chase the dark all the way back. It lived at the edge of vision, just beyond the reach of the glow, waiting for someone to stray too far. There were no lanterns, no torches burning on posts. The night wasn't pushed back, it was endured. For the people of the Stone Age, darkness wasn't empty, it wasn't quiet. It was full of movement, full of sounds they couldn't always name. Eyes reflecting low to the ground, soft paws brushing past dry leaves, heavy breath that didn't belong to anyone in the camp. Sometimes it was a fox, sometimes a boar, sometimes it was worse, and you didn't always get to know which until it was too late. There were stories, not myths, but memories. Someone's cousin who wandered off after dark and never came back. An old man who stepped outside the shelter to relieve himself and was found the next morning torn open at the legs. A child who followed glowing mushrooms too far into the forest. Everyone had one. Everyone knew not to ask questions when someone came back quiet, with eyes that didn't blink enough. They'd seen something, or lost someone. The night took things, that was just how it was. Even the bravest hunters didn't challenge the darkness directly. They might talk big when the fire was high and the clan was close, but when the embers dropped low and the circle grew smaller, their voices dropped too. No one sat with their back to the trees. No one volunteered to fetch water once the sky went black. Some said it was superstition, but those people didn't last. Anyone who disrespected the night was usually gone before long, taken by something they underestimated. If not an animal, then the cold, or the silence, or their own mind unraveling in the pitch of it all. Without fire, nightfall was an unspoken countdown. As soon as the sun began to sink, everything shifted. Conversations ended quicker, tools were packed up faster, meals were eaten with more focus. The youngest children were bundled in furs without protest. The ones who managed the fire took center stage, not as leaders, but as guardians. People watched them closely, waiting for signs of trouble. A bad pile of wood, a low wind, a snapped spark. These things could spell disaster. If the fire failed, there would be no light, and without light, they were exposed. Some groups tried to keep multiple fires spread around the edge of the camp. It made people feel safer, like the flames were pushing the dark away in all directions. But that took more wood than they often had. So most settled for one large central fire, built deep into a pit, lined with stones they'd heated during the day. The fire was fed carefully, steadily. Too much, and it would flare up, waste heat. Too little, and it would die. No one wanted to be the last to notice the fire was fading. The dark played tricks. Shapes moved where nothing should be. Sounds became more than sounds. You'd swear you heard voices sometimes, your name whispered low from behind the trees, or footsteps circling the camp long after everyone was asleep. But you didn't investigate. That was the rule. You stayed by the fire, you closed your eyes tight. You reminded yourself that fear could lie, but the dark never did. The dark simply was, and it was never on your side. Even inside shelters, darkness found its way in. The grass-woven roofs let in thin beams of moonlight that slid across faces like ghosts. The wind slipped through seams in the wall and fluttered sleeping furs just enough to mimic breath. A baby would cry, a dog would whimper, and no one would sleep again until the coals outside were stirred back to life and the camp hissed with warmth once more. The elders remembered older darkness. They spoke rarely about winters where even fire wouldn't catch. When the air was too wet, or the wood too rotten, they talked about the year they burned all their tools just to keep one ember alive. of the girl who gave up her blanket for kindling and didn't wake up the next morning. These stories were told not to frighten, but to remind. Fire wasn't a given, it was borrowed, and the dark never stopped trying to take it back. In those nights, people didn't just stay close to the flame, they leaned into it. They watched it as if it could speak. Some said you could read the future in the way the fire danced, that if the flames bent low, danger was coming. If they flickered without wind, someone in the camp had lied. Whether or not these things were true didn't matter. What mattered was the belief, because belief kept people near the warmth, and warmth, more than anything else, kept people alive. You wouldn't survive a single Stone Age night without fire, not because the cold would kill you instantly, but because the dark would wear you down, slowly, quietly. The cold might numb your fingers, but the dark would chip away at your mind. You'd start seeing things that weren't there, start hearing your own thoughts too loudly. You'd step away from the circle just once, and that would be enough. For them, night wasn't rest. It was risk. Sleep wasn't a comfort, it was vulnerability, and every hour they made it through without something from the dark reaching in and taking one of them, that was a victory. A silent one, a sacred one. And it all depended on the fire, still crackling at the center of everything, burning not just wood, but fear, doubt, and the long slow hunger of the night. How the fire watched before we did. At some point, they stopped thinking of the fire as just a thing. It became more than heat, more than light. It was presence. It had moods. It listened. It responded. You could sit in front of it without saying a word, and it felt like something was watching back, not in a threatening way, not like the forest with its hidden eyes and soft rustles, but in a way that made people feel less alone. The fire was steady, predictable, in a world that rarely was. It didn't promise anything, but it never left without reason. It didn't forget. It simply burned, and in that there was a kind of comfort. Some people talked to it, quietly, under their breath, not full conversations, just little murmurs, as they stirred the coals or placed a log, just so. Others fed it with extra care, offering bits of fat or dry herbs before sleep, not because the fire needed them, but because it felt right, like respect. The way you might speak gently to a river before crossing it. The fire, after all, was what kept everything else at a distance. The cold, the dark, the eyes in the night. Without it, there was no border, no line between safety and silence, but as long as it burned, they could rest with their backs to the world. The youngest in the group, the ones too small to hunt or gather, were the ones who watched it most. They'd sit closest, eyes wide, mouths quiet, tracing the orange curls as they danced upward. The flames held them in a trance, like a moving dream. Sometimes they whispered to each other about what they saw in it, shapes of animals, of ancestors, of things they couldn't name. They weren't afraid of the fire. They trusted it more than most things. And when the adults noticed how the children stared into the flames with such stillness, they said nothing. Maybe they remembered being that young, that close to the fire, before memory had language. The fire gave them more than warmth. It gave them rhythm. Life without time is just motion. The sun rises, the sun sets, and things happen in between. But fire broke that rhythm into pieces. They could understand. The day was for moving. The night was for gathering around flame. Meals were cooked by it. Stories were told beside it. Arguments faded in its glow, and songs drifted quietly into its smoke. Even silence felt different when the fire was burning. Less empty, more full, as if the fire was holding space for things unspoken. When someone died, they brought fire to the body, not to burn it, not always, that came later, but to witness it, to stand beside the stillness and remind themselves that something still flickered, still breathed and moved, even when the person did not. They said the flame carried breath upward, that it helped the spirit find its way, and though no one could prove it, they did it every time, without exception. The fire, they believed, saw what they could not. Some clans began assigning firekeepers, not just anyone who happened to be awake, but someone chosen, usually a child, or someone too injured to travel far, someone with the patience to watch. The job was simple: keep it alive, feed it, protect it, stay with it, when others slept or scattered into the woods. But over time, it became something deeper. The firekeeper was not just a guard, they were the memory of the group. They saw everything, heard everything. While others hunted or worked, the firekeeper remained still, listening, remembering, watching through the smoke. Because fire was the one thing that could not be remade easily. You couldn't just strike a stone and expect a blaze. You needed dry tinder, the right kind of wood, hands that knew the rhythm, lungs that knew when to breathe. Sometimes it took hours, days, sometimes it never caught. So once the fire was lit, it was sacred. You didn't let it die. You built your day around it. You moved camp only when you could carry the flame with you. In hollow stones, in bundles of moss, hidden in ash, cradled like an infant. It watched over them, even when they couldn't watch for themselves. When sleep crept in, when snow fell louder than footsteps, when the air grew thin, and the world outside the shelter turned still, the fire stayed awake. It crackled when the wind changed. It dimmed when something heavy passed near. It roared when fed, hissed when wronged, and sighed when the wood had burned just right. And in those small signs, they read warnings, they read comfort, they read what little they could in a world with no maps, no clocks, and no written truth. The fire didn't speak, but it remembered, and in its memory, they found enough to carry on. A spark in the grass. No one knew exactly where the first spark came from. Some said it was lightning. A branch struck down in a sudden storm, splitting open with smoke still curling from its center. Others said it came from watching the way stones scraped together under pressure, or the friction of wood spun against dry bark until something glowed. But long before they learned how to make fire, they learned how to find it. That was the first lesson. You didn't create fire. Not yet. You discovered it, caught it before it died, and learned how to keep it alive longer than the wind wanted. It was often children who found it. Not because they were searching, but because they noticed things adults didn't. They wandered more. They picked up what others stepped over. One story, passed down from a quiet river valley, told of a girl who wandered off after the sky had cleared. The storm had flattened a grove of trees nearby, and something in the wind smelled wrong. Not rot, but something sharper. She followed the scent, barefoot and silent, and found the grass still smouldering in patches, faint curls of smoke rising from a fallen pine. Most would have run, but she stayed, sat near it, felt the warmth, and when it flickered low, she tore a strip from her own tunic and pressed it against the edge of the glowing bark. That girl returned to her people with a coal wrapped in damp cloth, held inside a broken turtle shell. She carried it like a newborn, hands trembling, arms stiff, not speaking. When the clan saw what she had, they didn't speak either. They just began gathering wood. There was something sacred in that first act, finding fire and choosing to keep it. It wasn't just luck, it was instinct, patience, timing, and a kind of reverence. Those who treated the spark with respect often succeeded. Those who took it for granted, who thought flame was flame, no matter how it came, lost it quickly. A gust of wind, a drop of rain, a careless footstep. Fire could die faster than it was found. After that first fire, they started watching storms more closely, not with fear, but with curiosity. They followed the lightning, not away from it. If a bolt hit a tree, someone would be sent to check it, alone or in pairs. They'd look for smoke, heat, the reddish gleam of half-burned bark, and if they found it, they would begin the ritual. Dig out the coal, feed it gently, wrap it in dry moss, shield it from breath and wind, and then carry it home. Carrying fire was a skill in itself. You couldn't rush, you couldn't rest. You had to walk steadily, holding it close enough to feel the heat, but not close enough to smother it. Some used bone vessels packed with ash to hold the coal in place. Others carried ember bundles on long sticks, turning them gently as they walked. It was tiring, careful work, and it made you a guardian of something much bigger than yourself. By the time a fire returned to the clan, it had already passed through hands, through distance, through silence. People gathered not just to warm themselves, but to witness. The flame was not just a tool, it was a story. One that began in the grass, where the spark first appeared. One that was carried through forests, along rivers, over mountains. One that had survived 1,000 chances to disappear, and still burned. The first spark in the grass wasn't the beginning of fire, but it was the beginning of firekeepers, people who understood, even without words, that to carry flame was to carry life. They didn't think of themselves as special, they didn't speak of what it meant, but when the fire returned to the center of camp, and the wood caught, and the orange glow spread across familiar faces, they felt something in their chest, something warm, and ancient and steady, and for that night at least, the dark stayed back. The day lightning gave us a gift. No one could ignore the sound of it. Lightning didn't arrive quietly. It came with a kind of violence that stopped people mid-step. It cracked the sky in half, and lit the bones of trees from the inside out. Most animals ran when it came, even the ones that normally stood their ground. Birds took flight, Wolves vanished. Even the wind seemed to pause for a breath before the storm began. But the people didn't always run. Not all of them. In one clan, far up along the river's bend where the forests grew thick and the land sloped toward a valley, they remembered the day lightning gave them a gift. It had been an ordinary morning at first. Grey, still, with a low weight in the air that made everyone quieter than usual. The older ones looked up often. They could feel something shifting above them. Not yet danger, but something close to it. By midday, the sky had turned dark, and a hush fell over the trees like a blanket. No birds called, no insects hummed. It was the kind of silence that warned you, even if you didn't understand the words. Then came the first flash, a bright white gash across the sky, followed by a sound so loud it made the ground vibrate beneath their feet. The children covered their ears. Some of the dogs whimpered and ran into the woods. The air smelled sharp, a mix of ozone, smoke, and something else they couldn't name. The sky opened, and rain poured so quickly it felt like it had always been raining. Most of the group huddled in their shelters or beneath the shallow caves along the ridge. But one man stayed out. He wasn't the strongest or the boldest. He was a quiet gatherer, someone who spent more time with herbs and bark than with weapons. But that day he didn't flinch. When the second bolt of lightning struck, hitting a tall pine in the clearing beyond the hill, he stood completely still. Not in defiance, in attention. He saw something no one else did. As the others shouted and scrambled for cover, he walked toward the smoke. By the time the rain eased and the thunder rolled farther off into the distance, the tree had collapsed. It lay on its side, blackened and steaming, the trunk split wide open like a cracked bone. Inside, amid the wet and ash, something glowed, not bright, not roaring, just a faint orange pulse, deep in the heart of the tree. He dropped to his knees and shielded it from the wind with both arms. He tore strips from his tunic, pressed them to the ember, and breathed slowly. Not too much, just enough. The ember caught, he wrapped it in moss and dry reeds, held it inside a hollowed stone bowl used for grinding roots, and carried it back through the forest as if the whole storm might return to take it back. When he reached the camp, they didn't cheer, they didn't shout. They gathered around him in silence, watching as he unwrapped the ember, fed it bark and sticks, and coaxed it to life. The flame flickered once, then rose, not high, but steady. Someone laid a branch across it. Someone else began piling stones. The fire grew. They watched it the way you watch something sacred. No one spoke until the flames had climbed past their ankles. That night, the man didn't say much. He sat beside the fire, turning small pieces of wood in his hands, listening to the pop and hiss, as if it were telling him a story. But the others spoke of what he had done. They called him lightning-touched, not in the way of being burned, but chosen. They said he'd gone into the storm, and returned with a piece of the sky. That he hadn't just seen the fire, he'd heard it, understood it, brought it back. For years they kept a tradition. Whenever lightning struck near the camp, someone would go out and search. Not everyone returned with fire, but they always tried. Because now they knew it was possible. That fire could fall from the sky, that the same thing that split trees and terrified animals could also be the beginning of warmth, of food, of survival. And they didn't take it lightly. They learned to read the storms, the color of the clouds, the rhythm of the thunder, the way the leaves flipped over just before the first bolt struck. They knew that most lightning was just sound and fear. But sometimes, if you paid attention, it gave you something more, not by accident, but because you were ready to catch it. And so the memory of that day lived on, not in words carved in stone or drawn on cave walls, but in the careful way they watched the sky, and in the silent reverence they gave to the flame each night. The day lightning gave them fire wasn't a miracle. It was a message, a reminder that even the most violent parts of the world could leave behind something warm, and they never forgot who brought it home. The ones who tried to carry the flame, they didn't always make it. That was something no one liked to say out loud. But everyone knew, carrying fire wasn't just a duty, it was a gamble. If the weather turned, if the wind shifted, if the bundle wasn't packed just right, or the moss was too damp, or the stone cracked in the cold, the ember would die, and sometimes, so would the person carrying it. There were no roads, no maps, the land between camps was wild and slow, rivers could swell overnight, forests could block out the sun for days, predators roamed without pattern, and the weather didn't warn you before it changed. Fire had to be moved carefully, protected from all of it, but sometimes it just wasn't enough. There were stories of men and women found curled beneath trees, their arms wrapped tight around a cold, blackened bowl. The fire had gone out, and so had they. Still, people volunteered, always, without being asked. There was something unspoken about it, a quiet agreement passed down through glances, through gestures, through the hands that taught you how to hold the ember just close enough, but not too close. They called it the burden of the flame, but not in a heavy way. It wasn't shame, it was something closer to inheritance. You carried it because someone had carried it for you, because someone would need it tomorrow, because the clan couldn't go where fire didn't follow. They had many methods, depending on the season and the region. In the lowlands, where bark stayed dry longer, they'd pack the ember inside tubes of birch, sealed with fat and ash. In colder regions, they used stones, hollowed with care and warmed before the journey. Some lined their ember bundles with dry grass, feathers, or stripped bark fibers. Others built ember nests in clay jars, carried in thick fur slings across their backs, close to their body for warmth. The goal was always the same: keep it alive, keep it breathing. There were rules: no running, no shouting, no straying from the path. You didn't risk sudden movement, not with the ember in your care. You walked slow, you listened, you paid attention. The fire didn't like panic, it responded best to rhythm. And so the fire carriers moved in quiet, even steps, humming sometimes, talking low to themselves, anything to keep the breath of the flame steady. Fire changed you, that's what the old ones said, not just because of the weight of it, but because of what it made you see. Carriers spoke of dreams they had on the trail, of seeing people walking beside them, who weren't there, or feeling the wind push them away from cliffs before they saw them. Some said the fire whispered things, not in words, but in feelings. When to stop, when to turn, when to hide. Whether it was true or just the mind grasping at comfort, no one argued. The fire did what it had to do. So did the ones who carried it, and then there were the ones who failed. They weren't punished, they weren't cast out, but their names were remembered differently. You could hear it in the way stories about them were told, softer, slower, almost like an apology, not for what they did wrong, but for what they had tried to do right. There was one woman, years before the Valley tribe split, who had walked 3 days through snow with a dying coal. On the last night, she tore strips from her own coat to feed the ember. By the time she reached the others, frost had taken half her fingers, but the fire lived, and so did the clan. They remembered her name, not because she survived, but because the flame did. Every camp had someone who had once carried fire, even if just once, even if for a short distance. You could tell who they were by the way they treated the flames. Slower hands, more careful eyes. They sat closer, but moved less. They didn't speak while feeding it. They didn't poke or play. They understood that fire was not just a thing you used. It was something you asked to stay, something you invited in. It wasn't glory. No one clapped when a carrier returned. There were no feasts, no songs. Usually they were given water, then silence. People watched as the fire took root again, fed by fresh wood and new breath. Only then would the others come close, press their hands to the heat, and finally rest. And every time, every single time, someone would look at the flame and ask the question, not aloud, but in their heart, what if they hadn't made it? Because deep down they all knew. If the flame hadn't come back, neither would the food, or the safety, or the stories they told to hold back the dark. That's what it meant to carry fire. It meant carrying tomorrow, even if you didn't make it there yourself. The silence of the unburnt forest. Before fire touched the trees, the forest had a different kind of silence. Not empty, just old. Still, it was the kind of silence that had layers to it, the kind you didn't notice right away. At first it just seemed quiet. Birds here and there, wind pushing leaves in long, slow sighs. But after a while, when you sat still enough, you realized it wasn't silence at all. It was listening. The trees didn't burn back then. Not yet. The clans hadn't learned to cut deep into their hearts, to split their trunks or strip their bark for kindling. The forest was not fuel, it was a boundary, a wall, something dark and tall, and full of rules no one had written. The people stayed near its edge, close enough to gather food, to find water, to watch the patterns of animals moving like clockwork, but not much farther, not too deep. The ones who went too far often came back quiet. Some didn't come back at all. The unburnt forest was old in a way that felt personal. Every tree seemed to lean slightly toward you, as if remembering who had passed beneath it before. The ground stayed soft, damp with the memory of rain, even after dry days. Moss coated the stones like skin. Roots reached across paths like fingers, and the deeper you went, the heavier the air became. Not in temperature, in presence. It felt full of eyes, of things too patient to reveal themselves. There was respect for that kind of place, even fear. The kind of fear that didn't need screaming. It was quiet. It came in the form of stories told at night about trees that whispered or animals that watched from the shadows and didn't blink. But it wasn't a hatred. It wasn't a fear that came with anger. It was more like standing in front of something that had been alive longer than you could imagine, and knowing it didn't need you. The clans would sometimes gather near these woods and speak low, not to each other, to the trees. They'd leave pieces of bone or bits of food at the roots, just in case the forest was listening. When someone went missing in the deep woods, they didn't search too long. Instead, they'd light a fire at the edge and leave it there, not to burn the trees, but to mark the distance between the world of people and the world of the old green. But fire changes things, slowly, quietly. It taught people that not all wood was sacred. Some trees burned clean and fast. Others held heat for hours, and little by little, the forest became something else. Not a wall, but a resource. Still, some patches remained untouched. Places where the moss grew thick, where the branches arched high like ribs over an old path no one used anymore. These were the unburnt forests, not because fire couldn't reach them, but because something deeper held it back. One time, during a dry season, a storm passed through and lightning struck deep in the forest's heart. The clan waited, watched. They expected to see smoke, maybe even flames crawling up the trunks like animals, but nothing came. Just silence, the same silence as before. Some said the trees had swallowed the fire, others believed the earth had refused it. Either way, it didn't spread. The forest stayed unburnt, and the people didn't try to change that. They came back days later and found the scorched mark still on the tree's bark, black and cracked, but alive. Around it, the moss had grown thicker, almost as if protecting the wound. The leaves above had only just started to curl. There was no ash on the ground, no smell of death, just that old silence again, watching, waiting. And from that day on, they said that not all places are meant to burn, not all wood is fuel. Some things are older than fire, and some silences are better left untouched. Why the night wasn't for sleeping. Sleep wasn't something you could count on. Not then, not in the world before doors and roofs, before locks and lights. Night came, and with it, a kind of tension that wrapped itself around the camp like a second skin. You didn't lie down and drift off. You lay still and waited. Waited to see what the dark would do. Waited to hear the sounds that told you it was safe, or that it wasn't. People didn't sleep all at once. That was too dangerous. Someone always stayed up, sometimes 2, sometimes 3, depending on the season and what they'd heard in the woods. Fire helped, but not enough to make them careless. There were things that fire couldn't stop. Hunger for one, not theirs, but others. The kind of hunger that crept low to the ground, with yellow eyes and slow breath, and even if no animal came close, the night itself could unravel you. It was too easy to imagine things moving just outside the circle of light. So they kept watch, not just to guard, but to hold the silence in place, to make sure it didn't stretch too far or press too close. You'd sit near the fire with a spear across your knees, listening. Sometimes you'd hum softly, sometimes you'd talk, but never too loud. You didn't want to wake the others, and you didn't want the dark to know you were nervous. Sleep, when it came in pieces. An hour here, a doze there. You'd lie wrapped in hides, eyes half closed, the sound of breathing all around you. And even then, some part of you stayed alert, ears twitching at any crack of a branch, any shift in the wind. Dreams came quickly, but didn't last. Sometimes they weren't dreams at all, just the mind replaying the shape of a tree or the flash of a shadow and asking, was that real? The elders had stories about what the night used to be, back before the world was split between dark and light. They said that long ago, night was when the earth spoke, that the stars weren't just points of light, but eyes, not watching, but remembering. People used to sing to them, not loud songs, but murmurs, chants that helped them feel less alone. Sometimes they still sang, but not like before. Now the night was something to get through, not something to join. There were some who liked it, the watchers, the quiet ones. They felt more alive in the hush of it all. They could hear better, think better. Night gave them time to sharpen tools, to whisper old names, to sit with the fire and trace the edges of its glow. They said the fire looked different at night, more thoughtful, more steady, like it understood the weight it carried. And there were nights when nothing happened, when the stars blinked slow and steady, when the wind stayed still, when even the animals seemed to be resting. But even then, no one slept too deeply, because you never knew when the quiet would end. You never knew when the forest would remember it had teeth. So they took turns. One would sleep while another watched, then they'd switch, and when it was your turn to sleep, you didn't argue. You curled into the warmth of furs and hoped the one keeping watch had steady eyes and quiet feet. And if you woke in the middle of the night, which you often did, you wouldn't speak. You'd look toward the fire, check who was sitting closest, and if you saw their face lit by the coals, their hand slowly feeding the flame, you'd close your eyes again. Night wasn't for sleeping, not really. It was for holding on. The stone that waited beside the wind, before the fire, before the shelters, and the circles drawn in ash, there were stones, not just any stones, not the scattered kind that rolled loose across riverbanks or clattered underfoot on steep hillsides. These were older, larger, quiet in a way that made people lower their voices near them, without knowing why. The kind of stones that didn't just rest, but seemed to wait. There was one in particular, not far from a pass, where the grass grew sideways from the wind. It wasn't marked, no carvings, no paint, no handprints. It didn't glow or hum or bleed when touched. Not like the stories said sacred things did. It was just a stone, heavy, tall enough that you couldn't see over it, but not so wide that you couldn't reach around. It sat alone, where the trees opened just enough to let the wind slide through. The wind was always there, not loud, just constant. It would move through the grass in low waves, carry seed husks and dry leaves past your feet, tug at the corners of your tunic like it wanted your attention. And beside that wind, the stone never moved, never shifted, never cracked or wore down the way others did. It waited. The people noticed it early, long before they settled, when they were still following herds, moving from one shelter to another with no map but memory. They didn't use the stone for shelter. It wasn't shaped for that. They didn't climb it or sit on it. But they passed it, over and over. Each time they crossed that land, they found it in the same place, untouched, exactly where it had always been. After a while, they began to greet it. Not with words, not at first, just a touch, maybe, a hand against the cool side of its body, a bowed head, a hum passed through the teeth, and then later, offerings, a feather tucked into a crack, a single white pebble placed at its base, a strip of bark braided and left in the grass, not because they thought the stone could take or use or give anything in return, but because it felt wrong not to leave something behind. The old ones said it had been there since before the first fire, that the land knew the stone, that the wind that passed by it wasn't just wind, but memory, breath from the past, brushing against the stone again and again, checking to see if it still remembered. Some believed the stone had watched the first lightning strike, that it had seen a man kneel beside a burning tree and shield a coal with his bare hands, that the stone had watched him walk past, glowing bundle cradled against his chest, and had known something had changed. The stories never said what the stone thought of this, only that it remained. One child, a small girl, quiet even in her sleep, once sat beside the stone for an entire day. Her parents searched for her, frantic, shouting into the trees. When they found her, she wasn't frightened. She looked up from her place in the grass and said she had been listening. When they asked to what, she only pointed to the base of the stone, where the wind had pushed all the dry leaves into a soft circular nest. It was singing, she said, simply. They didn't ask again. That year the clan started taking a different path. They no longer passed by the stone on accident. They made it part of the journey. When they traveled between the summer camp and the winter trees, they stopped there for a while, just long enough to sit, to listen. They didn't speak much when they were near it. Voices didn't feel right there. You could hear your own breathing more clearly. You could feel how long the stone had been there, how little it cared about the movement of people, and yet it allowed itself to be seen. Eventually, they began bringing embers to the stone, just one, kept alive in a bone cup. They would place it beside the stone for a while, let the heat drift up its side, then return it to the carrier's pouch. The fire would crackle softly in its little nest, and the stone would stay cold, but the moment always felt like something more than ritual, like fire and stone were nodding to each other. Not friends, not enemies, Just two ancient things passing in the same world for a brief moment. They never built a fire next to it. That would be wrong. The stone wasn't for warmth. It wasn't for light. It was for stillness. The people didn't understand it fully. Maybe they weren't meant to. But the feeling never left them, that something deep in the earth had pushed this stone upward, planted it beside the wind, and then waited for someone to notice. And every time they returned to it, that quiet recognition was still there. Not welcome, not warning, just presence. The stone did not forget, and in its silence, neither did they. When the clan sat in circles, there was a shape to things, even before there were words for it. Long before stories were told, before the wind had names or the rivers were mapped in memory, people sat in circles, not because someone decided to, not because a rule was made, but because it made sense. The fire was in the middle, and so they sat around it, facing in, all eyes drawn to the same flicker, all backs turned to the dark. It didn't matter who you were, old or young, hunter or gatherer, wounded or whole. When the circle formed, everyone found a place. And in that shape, there was something more than warmth. There was balance. No one sat higher. No one hid behind anyone else. You could see every face in the glow. You could feel the breath of the person beside you, the soft shift of knees on earth, the sound of someone's hand gently brushing against the moss. It was the most honest shape they had. The fire made the center, but the people made the circle. It started simple. After meals, after long walks, when the day had tired itself out, they would come together. Someone would place another stick on the flames, someone would hum or chew roots or begin speaking softly without knowing why, and others would lean in. They didn't interrupt, they didn't ask questions, they just listened, the way the forest listened, the way stones did. In the circle, silence was allowed. You didn't have to fill it, you could just sit, feeling the smoke drift across your chest, watching sparks rise into the sky like memories escaping. There were nights when no one spoke at all, only the fire cracked, only the wind turned the leaves, but still, no one left, no one broke the shape. It wasn't about storytelling, not at first, it was about being seen, being part of something that didn't need to be built, or carved, or hunted, something that didn't move when you breathed. The circle held you, gently. It reminded people they weren't alone, not in the woods, not in the world. And eventually the stories came, not all at once, not from one mouth. Sometimes a child would ask a question without meaning to. Why does the moon move slower than the sun? And someone would answer. Not with facts, but with memory. They'd say, because it's older, or because it's looking for something. And someone else would add to it. And another would correct them, gently, with a version they'd heard as a child. The story would grow, not upward like a tree, but outward, like firelight, touching each face one at a time. The children sat closest to the flames, not because they were given the best seats, but because they always moved forward without asking. They wanted to see, to feel, to stare into the red and orange and gold, to watch the coals break open like tiny hearts, to let their thoughts flicker in time with the embers. The elders let them, because once they had done the same. Sitting in circles became a rhythm, a kind of breathing the clan did together, after wounds, after bad hunts, after births, after returns. It didn't matter the cause, they came together, always around the fire, always in that quiet, natural shape, no start, no end, no center, but the flame. They said the circle made the stories stronger, that words spoken within it stayed longer in the bones, that songs sung into the smoke traveled farther, that names once shared beside the coals were remembered even when the body was gone. Maybe it was true, or maybe it just felt true, and that was enough. And even now, deep in memory, in the part of us that still wakes up listening for the crack of branches in the night, we carry that shape with us. The ring of warmth, the glow between faces, the hush before a story. The circle we once sat in, when the world was quieter, and the fire knew all our names. Ash in the teeth of giants. They didn't call them giants. Not exactly, not with a word that clear, but there were places where the land broke in unnatural ways, where stones curved in wide, tooth-like arcs, and walls rose from the soil, in patterns too smooth to be accidents. Where the wind moved oddly, like it remembered turning corners that weren't there anymore, and where the people who passed through did so quickly, heads low, hands near the fire. The giants, if they ever existed, had been gone a long time. That was clear. The bones of their shapes remained, strange stone heaps in the hills, tree roots curling around half-buried pillars, pits that held nothing but a silence deeper than hunger. And always, scattered through these places like forgotten breadcrumbs, was ash, not fresh, not warm, not like campfire ash, thin and white and feather-soft. This ash was heavier, gritty, mixed with stone dust and something darker. It had weight to it, the kind that got under fingernails and stayed on the tongue. You could taste it, even if you didn't want to. They said it stuck to the teeth of those who breathed too deeply in the wrong places, that if you stayed too long in the old ruins, the ash would cling to your mouth, and no amount of water could rinse it away. And yet, they kept returning. Not everyone, not often, but when the fire had to be moved, when the land demanded a longer journey, sometimes the path went through the old bones, the giants' bones, some called them, the teeth of the earth. Others said it wasn't bones at all, but pieces of a world that had cracked before memory began. Whatever it was, it held power. Not the kind of power that made you strong. The opposite, maybe. It reminded you how small you were. The carriers who walked those paths moved differently, slower, more careful with their fire bundles. They spoke less. They tightened the moss wrappings, checked the ember cups more often, because something about those dead places made the flame twitchy, restless. It was harder to keep it breathing, as if even the fire didn't want to linger. There were stories passed down from those walks, of strange sounds, hollow and deep, like old hunger, echoing through stone, of wind that didn't match the sky, and stones that warmed at night instead of cooling. One woman claimed she saw footprints in the ash that didn't belong to any animal, wider than a man's chest, deep, too deep for something so light to have left behind. But she didn't run. She placed her ember at the edge of the print, let the fire glow faintly into the dark shape, and kept moving. They never built fires in those places, not full ones, only enough to keep the ember alive. There was a rule about that. You could pass through the giant's teeth, but you didn't ask them to share warmth. You didn't offer stories to the wind that moved through their old halls. You stayed quiet. You left no mark. You passed like smoke. And yet, every time they returned to the open land, every time the forest reappeared, and the air smelled of pine and damp soil again, they brought something back. Not in their hands, in their faces, in the way they sat nearer to the fire, in the silence that lasted a little longer before anyone spoke. Because the ash never fully left, it settled into the folds of their clothes, into the cracks of their heels, into the curve of their teeth, and maybe into their dreams. They said the fire burned differently after a journey through the ruins, less eager, more thoughtful. The coals glowed slower, deeper. The smoke drifted longer before vanishing. Some believed the giants were the first to make fire, that they'd built towers not for shelter, but to feed it, that they'd burned the world too hot, too fast, and left only bones behind. Others thought the fire was what destroyed them, that they'd worshipped it too much, trusted it with more than warmth, that the flame, once given everything, had taken too much in return. But those were only stories, and in the end it didn't matter. What mattered was that the path still led through their dust, and that those who carried fire, truly carried it, understood what that meant. You never outran the ash, you just learned how to walk through it. The first time smoke spoke, it didn't rise the way it does now, not at first. In the earliest fires, smoke was just a side effect, something you swatted away with your hand, something that made your eyes sting or your throat itch. It was what happened when wet wood burned, or when the wind turned suddenly. It was a nuisance, a warning maybe, but nothing more. Until the night the smoke stayed, they had built a fire at the foot of a cliff. Not a tall one, but steep, and shaped just so, like a bent hand cupping the flames. The air was still, the fire low and steady. The clan had walked far that day and eaten little, and most of them were too tired to speak. They sat near the flame and listened to the silence. A silence so deep that the crackling of wood felt louder than it should. Then the smoke began to move, not up, not out, but sideways. It curled along the stone, not thickly, not like fog. It didn't choke or blind. It drifted like breath, like someone whispering in slow circles just above their heads. One of the elders watched it, eyes half closed. He didn't speak, just followed the movement with the tilt of his chin. When it paused, just briefly, right above the fire, he said, "It's remembering." Someone laughed softly, unsure if it was a joke. But the old man didn't smile. He just leaned closer to the flames and whispered something no one else could hear. The smoke shifted again. No one slept that night. They watched it for hours, the way it bent, rose, thinned, changed color, how it pulsed when the wind pushed, how it circled the same spot twice before disappearing. It felt patterned, not like language, but like mood, like the fire was thinking out loud. From then on, they noticed things. Smoke didn't always behave the same. Sometimes it clung to the ground like mist. Other times it rose fast and disappeared into the trees. If it stayed low, they took it as caution. If it spun or danced, they watched for change. One hunter claimed the smoke spun in a tight ring before the wolves came near. Another swore it flattened before a storm. And slowly it stopped being the smoke. It became what the fire said. People started asking it questions, not in words, but in the way they watched, in the way they fed the fire. What kind of wood, what kind of bark, where they sat. They began to notice which kinds of smoke made them feel calm and which made them quiet in a different way. Some even believed smoke remembered people, that if someone died and their body was burned, the smoke that rose still knew their shape, that it drifted through the camp before rising higher, that it whispered through the trees and found its way to the places that person had once stood. No one tried to capture it. You couldn't, that wasn't the point. You watched it, you learned from it. You sat close and breathed slowly, eyes half-lidded, letting it wrap around you like a story you didn't yet understand. One child, too young to speak fully, began pointing at smoke like it was drawing pictures. Circles, waves, long fingers rising and breaking. Her mother watched her quietly. Then later that night, when the smoke coiled low around the fire, she pointed the same way. The shapes were there if you looked long enough, if you slowed your breath and stopped thinking in words. They didn't write those stories down. There was nothing to write with, nothing to write on, but the memory stayed, in the shapes of coals, in the flick of ash rising upward, in the way a whole group of people could fall into silence, together, as smoke passed between them. Smoke became more than fire's shadow, it became its voice. And even now, when the world has changed and fire lives behind glass or steel or switches, the smoke still speaks, if you let it, if you sit still long enough, if you remember how to listen. The children who learned to feed it. They didn't start with fire. The children were given sticks, dry ones, soft ones, bits of bark that cracked easily in small hands. They learned how to sort them, which snapped clean, which bent, which would smoke too much or vanish too fast. The older ones showed them how to press their thumbs along the grain, how to feel whether the wood had been touched by rain, how to tell if it had been resting too long in the shade. Before they ever came close to the flame, they learned how to watch it. That was the first rule. You watched before you touched. You sat close, knees drawn in, eyes half wide in that long blank stare children have when they're learning something deeper than words. You watched how the fire moved, how it leaned when fed, how it shivered in wind, how it hissed at damp wood and purred when it liked what it was given. The fire wasn't something to be fixed. It wasn't a thing you controlled. That was what the children were told again and again, not in scolding, but in reminders. The fire was a presence, not a pet. It didn't need to obey, it needed to be understood. And so the smallest ones began by handing sticks to the elders. Then they were allowed to place them, one at a time, gently, not tossed, placed, like setting a stone on a grave, or giving food to a guest who hadn't spoken yet. They watched the smoke, they learned its moods. They listened to the way flames made sound, a kind of wet cracking, a kind of dry laughter, a hush when it grew tall and proud. And in time they began to feed it themselves. Feeding the fire wasn't a chore, not like fetching water or scraping hides. It wasn't a job, it was an honor. The child chosen to feed the fire that night sat a little straighter, spoke a little less, their hands moved with a kind of reverence that other children noticed. Not jealousy, awe, because feeding the fire meant you were trusted, not just to keep it alive, but to listen to what it needed. And fire didn't always want more. That was the hardest thing to learn. The youngest always assumed more was better, that if a little wood helped, then a lot must be best. But that wasn't how it worked. Too much, and the fire lost itself. It choked, it forgot its shape. The flames danced too fast, the smoke thickened, and the warmth turned harsh. The fire had to breathe, had to stretch, had to rest between meals. The children who fed it learned this in their fingers. They knew when to wait. They learned to sit still, even when they were eager. To pause with a stick in hand, watching, listening, waiting for the right sound. The soft fall of coals, the gentle lean of flame toward the center. That was when you fed it. Not before, and sometimes you didn't feed it at all. There were nights when the fire was tired, when the wind outside was sharp and fast, and the clan huddled close, not talking much. On those nights, the fire burned low and slow, like it was hiding, and the children understood. They let it shrink, let it settle, covered it carefully in ash before sleep, as if tucking it in. And in the morning, when the coals glowed faint under the pale light of dawn, they'd uncover it, breath by breath, coaxing it back to life. One hand shielding the ember, one hand feeding it slivers of bark, a ritual as old as any story. Some of those children grew up to carry fire across rivers, others taught new hands how to wait, how to listen, how to give just enough. And some, the quietest ones, stayed by the fire their whole lives, never leaders, never hunters, just steady hands. The ones you trusted to keep the heart of the camp beating, because fire wasn't just a thing to be made. It was a thing to be kept. And those who learned to feed it, learned how to carry more than flame. What fire knew before we did. It always felt older than us, even when the clan had no word for time. No way to measure the passing of years beyond the bones of animals and the length of seasons. They still knew the fire had come first, not our fire, not the little circles of flame they built with moss and tinder and breath, but fire itself, the thing that struck down trees in storms, the thing that lived in the sky before it lived in their hands. They hadn't made it, not really. They had only found ways to invite it, to ask it to stay. And from the beginning, there was the strange feeling that fire already knew. It knew where to lean. It knew who was afraid of it. It knew when to shrink, when to stretch tall and proud. It changed its voice depending on who sat nearby. It crackled in some camps, whispered in others. It flared up suddenly when the wrong person touched it, then calmed when a gentler hand came close. Some said it could smell fear. Others believed it remembered things. The fire would burn different kinds of wood in different ways, but always with purpose, as if it had an opinion, as if it were choosing not just what to consume but how to show itself in the process. No two fires were ever the same, even when lit with the same ember, even when built with the same stones. Sometimes the people wondered, what did the fire know that they didn't? It always seemed to sense when danger was near. On nights before storms it flickered oddly, sending smoke in circles instead of rising clean. On nights when animals crept close, it hissed and popped more than usual. A young boy once said it was trying to talk. An elder nodded and said, "It's been trying since the beginning. We just don't always listen right." And over time the clan began to understand fire wasn't just a tool. It wasn't just heat or light or protection. It was a witness. It watched everything. It watched the carving of tools, the whispering of names, the birth of children, the burial of elders. It burned beside the first wounds and the last songs. It saw hands tremble when they reached for it, and it saw hands steady with purpose. It heard the first stories. It lit the first shared meals. It knew when someone left the circle and didn't come back. Some said the fire kept those memories, that every flame carried with it a little of what came before, not in sparks or smoke, but in the way it moved, in the way it made people feel. That's why certain fires made people cry without knowing why, or laugh, or speak names they hadn't said in years. One woman claimed that after her mother died, the fire flickered in the same rhythm her mother's hands had used when grinding grain. No one laughed. They just watched the flame, saw what she meant, and nodded. It wasn't about magic. It wasn't about worship. It was something else, something smaller, quieter, like finding a forgotten path in the woods and realizing someone had walked it before you long ago, and the fire had waited there ever since. It didn't belong to the people, and they didn't belong to it. But they lived beside each other, trusted each other, and when the world changed, when the camps shifted and the skies brought longer rains, the fire changed too. It adapted. It remembered how to stay. It taught them how to stay, because the truth was, they hadn't tamed it. It had welcomed them. Before they had words for it, before they had names for themselves, before they knew what they were becoming, the fire already knew, and it stayed anyway. The smell that meant home. It found you before you saw it, long before the firelight flickered between the trees, before the soft rise of voices, before the glow reached the edge of your path. There was the smell, not strong, not sharp, not the choking bite of something burning too fast. This was something warmer, thicker, a slow drift in the air, carried on the wind like a story told without sound. The smell of bark just starting to blacken, of moss drying too close to the coals, of old ash stirred by feet that hadn't yet sat still, of meat cooked low and slow, leaking fat into the wood. But underneath it all, the core of it, was the scent of home. Not a building, not a wall or a roof or a place with names, just the space where your people had stayed, long enough to let the fire sink into the earth, where the ground had soaked up the smoke of 100 nights, where every stone around the hearth held the memory of hands, of bodies huddled in sleep, of laughter, of arguments, of silence, so thick it could only belong to kin. The smell changed depending on where you were, high ground, wet forest, open plain, but it was always there, familiar, immediate, a smell you didn't notice when you were inside it, but missed the moment you stepped away. To the children, it was comfort. They'd press their faces into furs and smell smoke and dirt and warmth and say nothing, but you could see their shoulders drop, their eyelids lower. They didn't need to know why, their bodies already did. To the hunters returning from days away, it was relief. You could walk through cold and wind and hunger for hours and still feel like you were holding your breath until that smell hit. Then something in the chest loosened, the legs moved faster, the arms hung lower. You were close, even the dogs reacted to it. Ears perked, tails lifted. They knew it too. It wasn't clean. It wasn't pleasant in the way flowers are. It was dense and lived in. The smell of sweat and meat and damp hide drying too near the fire. The smell of wet wood catching too slow, of roots burning blue and bitter, of herbs scattered in coals to push back sickness. It was smoke that had soaked into skin and hair and teeth, but it was yours. They said that fire had a memory, not just of light, but of smell, that every fire burned slightly differently, depending on who had built it, who had fed it, who had sat beside it, while they wept or mended, or whispered the names of the missing. And the smoke carried that story into your hair, into your clothes, into the trees. Sometimes when someone died far from camp, lost, alone, too far to bring back, the elders would build a small fire at the edge of the circle, and burn the herbs that person had liked, or bits of the food they'd craved, or pieces of the plants they used to gather, just enough to send the scent up. They believed it would guide the lost one home, not in body, in memory, in belonging. Because that smell wasn't just fire, it was presence, it was knowing others were near, even if you couldn't hear them yet. It was safety that wrapped around you before arms ever did. It was the invisible shape of the place you'd left and returned to. The scent that reached you in the dark and said, without words, you're not alone. When fire replaced the stars, it didn't happen all at once. For most of their memory, the stars had ruled the night. They didn't shine for people. They simply were, cold, endless, unreachable. They told time, though no one had clocks. They showed direction, though no one used maps. They held stories long before those stories had shape. The stars were ancient company, silent, consistent, far above the winds and wolves and watching eyes. People slept beneath them, wandered beneath them, gave them names without meaning to. A crooked one that marked where the cold winds came from. A red one that reminded them of old blood. A cluster that looked like a mother curled around her children. The sky was not just above them, it was with them. But then came fire, not the fire of storms or lightning, or forests torn by drought, but the fire they chose to keep, the fire they carried, the fire they fed. A smaller, closer star they could gather around, warm their hands beside, whisper secrets into. And the more they fed it, the less they looked up. It wasn't a betrayal, not exactly, it was a shift, a slow turning of the eyes, the ears, the attention, because the fire told different stories. Closer ones, louder ones, stories that moved in real time, that responded to your breath, your fear, your hunger. The stars stayed distant, the fire leaned forward. The first to notice were the elders. They'd grown up under the open sky, used to sleeping with their backs in the dust and their eyes full of stars. They used to trace shapes in them, not constellations, just reminders. This star meant the rains were ending. That one came with the caribou. Another told you it was time to move. But the young ones weren't watching the sky anymore. They sat in circles, eyes locked on flame. The elders said little. They knew not to fight what was becoming natural, but they watched, and they remembered. The fire brought something new, control. You couldn't change the stars, couldn't reach them, couldn't quiet them, or summon them, or feed them. But fire. Fire needed you. Fire answered to your hands, your breath, your patience, and because of that, it began to replace the sky. Slowly the stars became background, faint pinpricks behind smoke and clouds, things noticed only when the fire burned low, or when sleep wouldn't come. The children learned to read flame before they learned to follow the moon. They could tell the mood of a fire by its sound, but struggled to find the path of stars that once marked the season's turn, and still, the sky stayed. It didn't scold, didn't fade in anger, it simply waited, as it always had. There were nights, rare and cold, when the fire went out too early, and no one rushed to relight it. Nights when silence stretched long, and the smoke rose gently into the black. On those nights, they looked up again, and the stars, impossibly far, impossibly patient, were still there. But now they were strangers, not hostile, not forgotten, just distant, and in time the stars became part of old stories. There was a time, the elders would say, when we slept under the open sky and named the stars like siblings. The children would listen politely, their faces orange in the firelight, but they didn't look up, not often, not like before. Fire had replaced the stars, not in truth, but in meaning. The stars were forever, but they were far. Fire was fragile, but it was theirs. It lit the faces of those you loved, it warmed the meat, it dried your skin, it carried your breath into smoke, it gave you something the stars never could, a center, and that center moved with you, lived beside you, shared your hunger, reflected your joy, it flickered like a heartbeat. The sky stayed, but fire belonged, and that changed everything. Why you needed it more than food. They never said it out loud. No one stood beside the fire and claimed it was more important than food. No one dared. Hunger was real, a sharp, twisting truth in the belly, in the legs, in the long walks and lean seasons. Hunger could hollow you, could bend your spine and slow your thoughts. It could steal your warmth, your judgment, your sleep. And yet, there were moments, more than moments, when they would choose fire over food. When a scrap of dry moss or a strip of bark meant for feeding flame was guarded more carefully than the last bite of dried meat. When they would carry the ember pouch through a storm, shielding it with their own bodies, letting their skin go cold, their stomachs go empty, just to keep it warm. You can't eat fire, but you need it, not just to cook, not just to keep meat from rotting or roots from poisoning the tongue, not just to boil water, to make it safe. There was something deeper, older. Fire fed something in them that food never could. It fed their presence. It gave shape to the hours after hunger, after walking, after wounds, after silence. Fire was the place they gathered, not to eat, but to return, to be, to see each other clearly. Food kept them alive, but fire reminded them why they wanted to be. There were times they'd go hungry by choice, to keep a fire burning through the long cold. They'd chew bark, sleep with empty bellies, trade meat to neighboring clans in return for dry wood, embers, ash, and when the fire caught, when it breathed again, they'd sit beside it like they were full, not warm, not safe, just whole. Children understood this before they had words for it. You could place a full bowl in a child's lap and still find their eyes drawn to the fire, mesmerized, held, as if it was feeding something else entirely, something behind the eyes, something too soft to touch. And fire gave more than food ever could. It gave sleep, safe, uninterrupted. It pushed the night away. It made the darkness smaller. The beasts didn't come close when the fire burned steady. Even the wind curved differently, as if respecting its glow. It gave memory. Stories were told in firelight, not daylight. Names were passed on beside the coals. When someone died, it wasn't food they placed at the edge of the grave. It was ash, a glowing ember, a sign that warmth had known them. It gave belonging. You might eat alongside strangers, but you only sat by the fire with those you trusted. Fire was not shared lightly. To be given a place near the flame was to be invited into something wordless, ancient, to be seen. It gave time. Without fire, the night stretched too long. You couldn't measure it, couldn't feel the hours moving. But with fire you knew, the way a log cracked as it split, the way the flame leaned, the way smoke slowed near dawn. The fire kept time before they had sundials, calendars or stars, and it gave ritual, feeding it, waking it, carrying it, covering it, watching it, waiting for it to catch. Fire was not a tool, it was a rhythm, It demanded attention, care, gentleness. It taught them patience. There were those who lived alone, far from clan, from camp, from sharing circles, hunters, outcasts, widows. Even they, when food ran low, would let themselves starve a little longer, just to keep the fire alive. Because the truth was this: you could survive a few days without food. But the dark, the silence, the cold emptiness of a world without fire, that broke something deeper. Fire didn't fill the stomach, but it filled you, in ways nothing else ever did. The meat that melted on stone. They didn't have pots, not yet. No bronze, no bowls, no metal edges to scrape fat from flame, not even clay, not for some time still. What they had was stone, broad, flat, sun-bleached, or river-worn, whatever they could carry, and lay near the fire without it cracking. At first they didn't cook meat. They tore it, they chewed it raw, or dried it on racks of woven reeds until it stiffened and held like leather. They ate what they had to, not for taste, but for survival. The body needed salt, blood, fat, the belly needed weight. The tongue didn't ask for more, not yet, but one day, no one remembered who or why, someone laid meat across a stone that had grown hot near the fire. Not directly in the flame, not roasted on a spit, just placed on the surface, left to sizzle and hiss, to weep out its oils onto the rock, to curl slightly at the edges like it was waking from sleep. They didn't mean to change everything, but they did, because when they pulled the meat away, gently with a stick or fingers toughened from years of scrapes and winters, it smelled different, and when they bit into it, it didn't tear, it yielded, soft, rich, slick with flavor. It fell apart in the mouth like it had been waiting to do so all along. No one spoke, not at first. They just looked at each other, blinked, chewed again. One of the elders grunted, low and surprised, and licked her fingers, a motion so instinctive it seemed older than speech, and they all knew this was new. From then on they started listening to stone. They found the ones that cracked in heat and left them behind. They kept the ones that didn't. They tested surfaces, smooth river rocks, wide slate, long pieces of sandstone that could hold more than one cut of meat. They learned which rocks held warmth longer, which cooked slower, which turned fat to steam, and the meat changed. It wasn't just softer, it was something else, something more than nourishment. It pulled flavors out of itself, salt, iron, a hint of smoke, and let them bloom. People closed their eyes when they ate, not from exhaustion, but from pleasure, a kind they didn't have a word for yet. The children started asking for it, not demanding, not begging, just watching the stones with hope in their faces, a quiet, mouth-watering kind of reverence. They'd wait beside the fire, watching the drip of juice, the slow curl of steam. They learned to listen to the sound of sizzling, sharp at first, then low and patient, a song only meat could sing. It wasn't just about taste, it was about what happened around it, because the meat that melted on stone wasn't eaten on the run. It wasn't torn apart in the dark, or chewed in silence, or swallowed in haste before predators came near. No, this meat was shared. They sat together, passed pieces, took turns. They didn't fight over the softest bites, they offered them, sometimes without words, just a hand extended, fingers pinching a perfect piece, placed into another hand without question. It became a kind of ritual, not sacred, just true. They cooked slowly, they fed elders first. They taught children how to listen for when the meat was ready, not burnt, not raw, but just before the fat smoked off completely. They learned patience. Fire taught that, so did hunger, but the stone, and what sizzled on it, taught care, and something else changed. People grew stronger, faces fuller, bodies that once shook in the cold, held warmth longer. Children stopped dying so young, mothers bled less. The meat changed by fire, kissed by stone, gave more than flavor. It gave life. Easier life, life that didn't always end with winter, and still, the memory remained, not of hunger, but of the moment the first bite fell apart on the tongue, the way it didn't fight the teeth, the way it welcomed the mouth. They didn't write poems, didn't carve names into stone, but they remembered that moment. You could see it in the way they wrapped meat in bark to take on the trail, in the way they leaned closer when the smell thickened, in the long slow smiles passed between those who had waited for it together. They never stopped using fire to stay alive, but now, it also made life worth staying for, and all it took was meat, and stone, and time. Why the wolves stopped watching. The wolves had always been there, before fire, before names, before circles of stone. They watched from the edges, from the tree line, from behind the rocks, from the tall grass, heavy with dew. Their eyes caught moonlight, like still water. Their breath moved low across the dirt. You never heard the first one. You heard the second, and by then, it was already too late. The wolves didn't hate people, they didn't need to. They didn't fear them, either. In the old days, there was no reason to. People were clumsy, slow, thin-skinned. They bled easily, and smelled loud. They dropped food, they cried when hurt, they walked with their heads too high, and their ears too dull. To the wolves, people were noise, and noise meant weakness. So the wolves watched, not with cruelty, with calculation, with patience. They knew the rhythms of people better than people did. They knew when children wandered too far, when hunters limped back alone, when women gathered roots too long after dusk. They knew what cries meant help, and which ones meant no one is left to answer. And then, fire came. It didn't change everything overnight. The wolves still watched, still paced in silence when the sun dropped, and the scent of cooking meat drifted on the wind, still curled beneath the brush, and counted heartbeats, waited for one to stumble, for one to forget. But something was different. At first the wolves couldn't understand it. Fire had always existed, in lightning strikes, in burning trees, in the far-off smell of forests dying. But this was smaller, slower. It stayed through the night. It didn't rage, it didn't scream. It crackled softly, flickered gently. It sat in the center of the people, like a thing they trusted, a thing they fed. It made the air dance, it made shadows long and strange, and it made the people still. The wolves watched as people gathered closer, not farther apart. As they sat beside something glowing and red instead of hiding in trees, they watched the food move toward the fire, instead of away, and then they smelled it. Not the raw, torn meat they had known for seasons beyond counting, but something else. Cooked meat, changed. The scent was rich, oily, new. It didn't scream prey, it whispered something more confusing. It smelled like power, like patience, like something that had waited. The wolves began to wait, too. They circled slower, farther out, because the fire didn't just warm, it moved the world around it. The wolves began to learn its moods. When it hissed, it meant water. When it roared, it meant wind. When it snapped sharp, the people were restless. When it purred, they were calm. And the wolves, who had once lived by teeth and timing alone, began to understand something was happening. People had always feared the dark. It was the wolves' domain, the world between moon and silence. But now, people had carved out a hole in that dark, a circle of brightness that didn't sleep, and the wolves for the first time were the ones who blinked, because fire was more than light. It was pattern. It moved in a way that animals understood, but not fully. It didn't chase, it didn't flee, it stayed, and it claimed space. The first time a wolf stepped too close, the fire answered, not with teeth, not with growls, with heat, with sudden unblinking presence. The fur singed, the eyes narrowed, and the wolf understood. This was not prey, this was something else. The clan began to notice. They saw fewer eyes at night, heard fewer steps in the dark. The children stopped waking to distant howls, and one night, when a rabbit had been left roasting and forgotten, no one came to steal it. The wolves were still near. They could be heard in the hills, farther off now. Their howls echoed over rock, not through trees. Their scent lingered faint at the edges of the wind. Old habit, old curiosity. But they didn't come near the circles anymore. They stopped testing the silence. It wasn't just fear, it was recognition. The wolves who had ruled the night saw something familiar in the flame, something wild, but shaped, something born of chaos, but held steady in human hands. It made no sound of pain, it didn't bleed, and yet, the people fed it, sat beside it, trusted it, and the wolves, hunters of warmth, of breath, of blood, watched as people sat in comfort, backs turned to the dark. They'd never done that before, and so, the wolves stopped watching, not from defeat, from understanding, because the fire, in some quiet way, had become the new predator, not in body, in spirit. It demanded space, it drew eyes, it shaped the dark, and it taught the people something the wolves already knew. To survive you must carry your fear carefully, and know when to feed it. The firekeeper's burden. There was always one, not because someone declared it, not because the clan voted or named or ranked. It just happened, quietly, naturally. One person, not always the oldest, not always the strongest, began to rise a little earlier, sleep a little later, sit closest to the coals long after the others had drifted into dreams. The firekeeper, they didn't always call them that. Sometimes there was no name at all, just a glance, a nod, a small respect in the way people stepped around them, or the way they left a space clear by the flame without asking. A role passed, not by words, but by habit, a rhythm taken on by the one who could hold it. Their hands were usually marked, ash deep in the creases, fingertips dry from heat, the pads of their thumbs smooth from turning bark and bone, their voice quiet, not out of shyness, out of observation. Firekeepers didn't interrupt. They watched, because fire doesn't like to be startled. It doesn't like to be forgotten, and keeping it alive, truly alive, means learning its moods better than your own. The firekeeper was the last to sleep. Even when the body begged, when the muscles burned, when the eyes blurred from smoke and exhaustion, they stayed up just a little longer, watched the coals, shifted the logs, nudged the embers into one another like sheep herded softly by hand, and they were always the first to wake, before the sun, before the birds, often before the frost had lifted. Their breath puffed in clouds as they leaned near the ash pile, fingertips feeling through the grey for any hint of heat, a pulse, a glow, a living ember hiding deep. Some mornings there was nothing, just cold silence. On those days, they didn't panic, they didn't complain, they started again. Flint, bark, pressure, patience. Their hands moved with memory, not urgency. And when the first curl of smoke rose, it wasn't a celebration, it was a continuation, a quiet promise kept, because keeping the fire alive wasn't about pride, it was about presence. When storms came, it was the firekeeper who sat closest, shielded the flame with stone or hide or body. When the clan moved camps, it was the firekeeper who carried the ember pouch, leather-wrapped, ash-lined, breath-warmed, a heart of red hidden in soot. And if the ember ever died on the trail, it was the firekeeper who said nothing, and simply walked ahead, searching for dry moss, dry bark, a second chance. Others might hunt, might gather, might fight, but the firekeeper's burden was slower, constant, invisible, most days. Yet everyone felt it when it failed. The night without fire was longer, colder, more silent. The wind crept closer, the wolves came nearer, and the stories didn't come at all. Only then did they realize what the firekeeper gave. Not just flame, not just warmth, but continuity. Without them, the clan drifted. With them, the fire stayed lit, and so the burden was passed. When the old hands grew still, another pair, smaller, younger, not always ready, began rising early, sitting later, listening closer. It wasn't about control, it was about care, and the burden wasn't heavy because it was hard, it was heavy because it mattered. When sparks became secrets, at first everyone watched. When fire was still a wonder, still something rare and shivering with the memory of storms, people gathered close to see how it lived. No one owned the fire, no one guarded the act of feeding it, or waking it, or coaxing it back to life when the coals had almost forgotten how to glow. Children were allowed to sit near as the flint struck stone, as the sparks jumped, as the tinder was pressed into a tight little nest, and the first threads of smoke began to rise. There was no hiding, no turning of backs, just breath and waiting, and the quiet understanding that this was something shared. But over time, something changed, not all at once. It began with glances. Certain people who worked the spark faster than others, whose fires caught quicker, burned steadier. People with a rhythm in their hands, with a patience that looked effortless. They stopped explaining what they were doing. Not because they were cruel, but because words didn't seem to help. Others copied their motions, and failed. Others watched, repeated, and got only ash. So those with the gift grew quiet. Some took pride in their silence, some were just tired of being asked. And slowly, sparks became something not everyone could make. You could still carry fire, still feed it, still sit beside it. But the making of fire, the striking, the shaping, the moment of breath, where smoke turned to flame, became something only a few knew how to do. Those who could began to guard the knowledge. They said nothing directly. They didn't refuse to help, but they made you wait, made you watch, and if you didn't listen with your whole self, they would simply not try again. It became a test. The ones who truly wanted to learn had to do more than ask. They had to prove something. Steadiness, quiet, the willingness to sit in failure without blaming the stone. because fire didn't like arrogance. The ones who treated it like a trick, they failed. But even as some learned, fewer shared. They began to protect their methods, carried flint wrapped in hide, hidden away, used secret tinder they didn't explain, bark soaked in sap, herbs dried in shadow, fibers chewed until soft and flammable. It wasn't about selfishness, not always. Sometimes it was fear, because the ones who shouldn't make fire, the ones who might waste it, or weaponize it, or forget to feed it, were just as eager to learn. So the knowledge moved underground, into families, into lineages, into whispered lessons passed only when the coals burned low and the wind was calm enough to keep words close. They began calling them fire holders, spark singers, mothers of flame, not as titles of glory, but of responsibility. They carried not just the skill, but the weight of knowing what others had forgotten or had never been shown. And the sparks became secrets, not because fire had changed, because people had. Because fire could no longer be just warmth, it had become something more, a sign of knowing, a sign of power, and once something holds power, people guard it, even when it was once meant for all. What the cold took from the unprepared, it didn't roar. The cold didn't announce itself with thunder or fire or fury. It didn't scream like hunger or howl like wolves. It came softly, quietly, like a guest who didn't knock, only stepped inside when no one was watching the door. That was always how it began. The first signs were so small they didn't seem like signs at all. A breath that stayed too long in the air. A puddle that didn't soak into the ground. A stillness in the wind, like the world was holding itself tight. And then frost. Not much. Just a thin white edge around the leaves. A lace of ice where water had gathered in the night. Some noticed, most didn't. The morning fires burned it off quickly, and the clan carried on. But the cold doesn't leave. It waits. And it watches. It watched when someone forgot to dry their furs. When a child wandered too far without boots. When the fire was allowed to burn too low. Because the wood was damp and the hunger was louder. It watched. And it remembered. Because the cold doesn't have to strike all at once. It only has to linger. A single toe that stays wet too long. Fingers left bare while gathering bark. A breath drawn too deep before sunrise. And slowly the cold begins to take. It takes sensation first, not pain. That comes later. First is the dullness, the soft creeping numbness that feels more like relief than danger. Your hands stop aching. Your legs stop trembling. Your face forgets to wince, and you think maybe it's passing. It's not. The cold wants you to feel safe. That's how it wins. The unprepared always believe they have more time, more daylight, more strength, more warmth saved in their skin from the fire they left behind. But fire fades, and skin forgets, and breath slows, and still, the cold doesn't rush. It doesn't chase you down. It just waits for you to slow. The first to go is often feeling, in fingers, in toes, then come the thoughts. Speech gets soft, memory flickers. You forget where you were walking. You sit down to rest, just for a moment. The fire is close. You think, the others will see me. You think. You don't notice how long your hands have been still. That's what the cold takes next movement, not all at once, but in pieces. It whispers to the body, telling it to rest. You're tired. You deserve it. Just sleep a moment. Close your eyes, let the weight of the day finally fall, and if no one sees you, if no one notices the stillness in time, then it takes the rest. It doesn't steal, it receives, as if you gave yourself away. But not everyone was taken, because over time people learned. They learned that cold is not a season, it's a test, a quiet trial that returns again and again, to see who remembers. The prepared made bundles before the frost came. Not after. They dried their furs twice, not once. They kept firestones near the skin, never just in pouches. They watched the youngest, watched the oldest, took turns keeping fire even when the night was long, and the eyes were heavy. They didn't let pride guide them. They didn't say, I'm strong, I'll be fine. They said, I remember what it did before. Because the cold doesn't care who you are, it only cares what you forget. And in the end, that's what it takes more than anything. Memory. The memory of how it felt to lose someone to silence. The memory of what it means to walk back into camp with fewer steps behind you than when you left. The memory of the names never spoken again. The fire was warmth. But memory, that was survival. And those who remembered, prepared. and those who didn't, they were remembered by others. The last ember and the long walk. It was supposed to last the night. The fire had burned low, yes, but not out. They had circled the coals with stone. They had fed it before sleep. They had done what they always did, what had always been enough. But that morning, when the sky was still grey and frost curled under the hides, the fire was gone. No smoke, no glow, just silence and the brittle crack of white ash under cautious fingers. They didn't panic. Not right away, it happened, sometimes. A wind too soft to hear, a shift in the logs that pulled heat apart instead of feeding it. Someone forgot to bank the coals before sleeping. No one was blamed. The cold was cruel, but the fire was forgiving. If you moved fast, there was still one ember, maybe two, nestled deep at the bottom, under the thickest ash. Barely alive. No glow unless you breathed close and long. No warmth unless your fingers touched so near they risked burning. If the ember surprised you back to life, they could have started again. Flint, tinder, breath, but it had rained. The moss was wet. The bark was damp. The tinder bundle was half soaked, and the youngest had been coughing all night. They had no time for failure, no time for flame that might catch. So someone stepped forward. I'll carry it. Not a volunteer, just a voice. A figure already wrapping the ember pouch, pressing the last coal into the soft bed of dry fibers saved for days like this. A face already streaked with ash. Not the fastest, not the strongest, but steady. The ember was wrapped tight, not smothered, just swaddled, held like breath itself. If you pressed too hard, you'd crush it. Too loose, the cold would steal it. It had to be carried, like a story, like a song too faint to sing aloud. The others watched them go. They didn't say goodbye, not out loud. That would have made it feel like more than a task. And this was just a task. A short walk, a known path, a neighboring camp, less than a morning's journey away. They had fire, always did, kept it burning even through the storms. If you reached them fast, explained the ember was dying, they would help, they would understand. But the cold moved faster than expected. The sky darkened sooner, and the wind, the one they hadn't heard the night before, returned. The ember carrier walked hard. Steady, arms folded to the chest. The pouch pressed just below the throat, where the heat of the heart could keep it alive. They didn't run. Running made you sweat. Sweat made you cold, cold made you careless. They walked, one foot, then the other, listening not to the wind, not to the trees, but to the faintest sound inside the pouch, the whisper of fiber, the imagined tick of ember breathing. At times they imagined it had gone out. They stopped, turned their back to the wind, opened the pouch just a crack, held their breath, leaned close. Still there, still red, still alive. The sky turned, the air thinned, and still they walked. This was more than survival. This was continuity. The ember wasn't just heat, it was every fire that had ever been shared. It was every story told at night. It was every laugh, every silence, every face lit from below while shadows danced along the cave wall. It was home. And so the carrier walked. Even when the legs ached. Even when the path blurred. Even when the voice in their mind whispered, "You could lie down now, just a moment, just rest." They didn't. Because fire was never just fire, and they were never just carrying flame. They were carrying return. Why you'd trade water for flame? The river was not far, just beyond the rise, past the dead trees, and down the slope of smooth stone. You could smell it before you saw it, that soft, green dampness curling up through the cold. You could hear it if you listened right, too, not the splash of fish or the rush of spring, but the low glug-glug of slow water moving under ice. They knew it was there, they knew it would save them, but they didn't go, because they were too busy feeding the fire. The sun had dipped early. The cold had come faster than the body expected, and when that first breath burned in the nose, and the wind cut sideways instead of head-on, they knew what kind of night it would be. The kind that took fingers, the kind that bit ankles raw, and made the teeth chatter so hard your skull throbbed. The kind that turned water into a trap, because water in the cold is a gamble. It soaks the clothes, it chills the breath, it freezes your hands before you finish drinking, and once inside you, if your core is cold, it can drag the last bit of warmth away from the center and leave you slower than before. But fire gave you something more. It gave time, time to plan, time time to think, time to wait for the wind to shift, or the stars to rise, or the pale light of morning to offer a gentler path. And in moments like that, when water was just over the hill, and fire was flickering low, you chose flame, even with a dry mouth, even with lips split from thirst, even when your breath rasped like leaves dragging across bark, because flame was something now, something certain, and thirst, for all its sharpness, could wait. It always had. You'd seen it before. Walkers on long hunts with swollen tongues and sunburned eyes, staggering into camp and reaching not for water, but for fire, sitting by it first, holding out their hands, letting the warmth tell their bodies they were still here, because water cools, fire restores. There were stories of those who'd run for water in a storm, thinking they'd be back in a moment, only to return to a dead fire, no coals, no warmth, no life. Some never made it back, some came back changed, cold inside, silent for weeks, like the part of them that trusted the world had stayed in the river. So sometimes, you let your throat burn, you cracked ice in your hands and gave it to the fire instead, to feed it, to melt it, to keep its breath going. You poured the water onto the stones to raise steam, to warm the space, to soften the air for sleeping. And when someone asked, why not drink it, you said nothing, you just watched the fire grow, because you knew without fire, thirst meant nothing. Without fire, there would be no morning to drink in, no strength to find the next stream, no voice to call out for help. And so, when it came down to it, when there was only enough for one, you traded water for flame, not because it was logical, because it was life. The hunt that ended in cinders, they had followed it too far. The tracks were fresh, pressed deep into the damp ground, wide and sharp, with that long dragging line behind, the mark of something heavy, something wounded. The kind of trail you don't ignore, not when food is scarce and bellies are light and the children have stopped asking when the next meal is coming. So they left just after sunrise. 4 of them, spear carriers, bowmen, 1 runner. They took strips of dried root, a skin of water, and 1 ember pouch, just in case. Not for fire out there, just for return. They weren't meant to be gone long, but the trail wound longer than expected. First west, then north, then into the low ravine, where mist clung to the ground, and the sky never quite cleared. The creature they were following, maybe a stag, maybe something older, didn't slow, even with blood in its print, even with 1 foot dragging. It ran like it knew what was chasing it, like it remembered fire. The hunters didn't stop, because hunger is louder than caution, and the fire, back at camp, was strong. When they left, it had been bright and fed, circled with stone, tended by the elder and 2 children, who knew how to watch coals. It was safe. It would last. So they pushed farther. They didn't notice when the wind shifted. They didn't smell the wet bark or feel the rising damp on their skin. They didn't hear the last whistle of the wind before it dropped silent. When they made the kill, finally late in the grey of dusk, it felt like triumph. The body was large, heavy. It would feed everyone. For days, they bled it quickly, thanked it quietly, then turned back. And that was when the air changed. The path behind them was harder to follow. Familiar stones looked different in reverse. The night fell too fast, the cold too deep. Still, they had fire. 1 ember, wrapped in hide, kept near the belly to stay warm. But when they unwrapped it beneath a crooked tree to make camp, there was no glow, only ash. They tried again. Flint, bark, nothing caught. Everything was wet. They sat through the night with the carcass at their feet, the cold creeping in, each of them thinking the same thing but not saying it aloud. What if the fire is gone back home too? When they returned, slow, sore, carrying meat that felt heavier now, the camp was quiet, too quiet, no smoke. The fire pit, cold, ash stirred in the wind, and the others, gone, not dead, not taken, just scattered, forced to leave when the fire died, and the night grew too hard to survive. They had taken what they could, some wood, a flint, but not the fire itself, that had gone to sleep before the meat ever reached their hands, and in its place, only cinders, black, dry, silent. The hunt had fed no one, because in chasing the thing that filled the stomach, they had lost the thing that held them together. Fire was more than heat, it was a tether, a signal, a promise. Without it, the camp wasn't a home, it was just a place the wind passed through. They dropped the meat at the fire pit, no one touched it. They sat for a while in silence, and when the wind finally picked up, lifting the scent of blood and ash into the empty air. One of them whispered, "Next time we carry the flame first," and no one ever forgot. How fire changed the way we spoke. Before the fire, voices were sharp, short, urgent, a language made mostly of warnings, gestures, grunts. The throat moved only when it had to call out danger, to signal food, to cry when pain struck sudden and deep. There was little space for softness. Speech had to compete with the wind, with distance, with predators that listened from the trees. The world was not quiet. So people weren't either. Words were tools, edged and fast, used to shape action, not memory. But fire changed that, not immediately. At first, it only warmed. Then it lingered. Then it stayed long after the sun had gone, when the world beyond its light slipped into dark and the body could no longer move. Only rest. That was when something new happened. Something the world had never asked of people before. Stillness. The fire stilled the hands, slowed the breath, gave the eyes something to watch that didn't move, like prey or threat. Just the steady flicker, the dance of red and gold, the rise of soft smoke like thought made visible. And in that stillness, voices returned. Not loud, not urgent. Soft, curved, like smoke itself. People began to talk in the firelight. At first, only small things, where the hunt had gone, who had walked furthest, where the berries still clung to the south-facing slope. But then, slowly, they said more. They asked questions they already knew the answers to, told stories they had told the night before, laughed at nothing, because language had begun to do something else, something new. It was no longer only for survival, it was for connection. Fire gave people the time to listen, the space between danger, the circle where no one had to run, or reach, or lift, just sit and speak. The first stories weren't long, just fragments, half memories, a word for a thing no longer seen, a sound for a dream that didn't fade. But the children listened, and the children asked, what happened after that? Who else was there? What did the stars say that night? And so words began to stretch, sentences lengthened, pauses became rhythm, names became more than labels. They became stories themselves. A name was not just who you were, it was who you had been. And all of this, slowly, quietly, gathered around the fire, because the fire didn't interrupt, it didn't leave, it didn't chase anyone away. It burned and waited, like a second listener, always flickering near the speaker's hands, casting shadows on faces, reminding everyone, this moment is safe. That was the gift. Safety enough to speak. The tongue began to trust itself. The mind began to shape things it had once only felt. A sadness could be named, a memory shared, a dream retold. And when a story ended, the fire didn't ask for silence, it just burned. And someone else, eventually, began again. That's how it changed. Not with new words, but with new uses, not just to warn, or call, or signal, but to remember, to soothe, to belong. So when people say language made us human, maybe, but maybe, it was fire that gave language its first true home. When the wind tried to steal it, the wind didn't hate fire. It didn't care. That was the danger of it. The way it moved without malice, without hunger, without thought. Fire could be fed, understood, watched, but wind simply was. It came when it pleased, from no place, from every place. It whispered through the trees one moment, and roared through the valley the next. It carried the scent of rain, the dust of distant plains, the cries of birds from cliffs no one had ever seen, and sometimes it carried fire away. Not all of it, just enough. Just the top of the flame, the tip of the heat, the breath of it, snatched, scattered, sent somewhere else. It never took the whole thing in one blow. That wasn't its way. The wind worked slowly. It stirred first, made the fire flicker, made the sparks dance sideways, not up. Then it pressed its full weight in, not a shove, but a lean. And that was when the fire began to struggle. You could hear it in the hiss, in the way it lost its rhythm. The flames tried to stand, but bent back again and again, until finally, the red turned to gold, the gold to ash, the ash to smoke, and just like that, gone. The clan had seen it happen before, once during a cold snap, when they had huddled together beneath the old cliff, and the wind came down like a river. The fire had been strong, tall, but it didn't matter. The wind took it in pieces, pulled it apart like dry grass, scattered it into the dark. They hadn't slept that night. No one spoke, no one moved far. They sat with eyes open, breath shallow, every sound of the forest too close. Since then, they had learned, the firekeeper built low now, not high, shielded the flame with flat stones, dug pits, when they could, raised barriers from driftwood and damp furs, anything to give the fire a place the wind could not reach. But the wind always reached, not out of spite, just out of motion. The clan called it the Sleepless One, not because it was cruel, because it was never still. The fire, they said, needed companions, wood, breath, patience, but the wind needed nothing. It came alone, left alone, and when it came for the fire, someone always had to stay awake. That was the rule. When the wind rose, someone stayed behind. They crouched low, arm around the pit, cloak stretched like wings behind them, face to the coals, eyes squinting against sparks, one hand moving, always moving, feeding, shaping, shielding. It wasn't heroism, it was duty, because when the wind came, it didn't just try to take the flame, it tried to take what the flame held: heat, safety, stories, memory, and if no one stood between them, the wind would scatter it all like dust. Some nights it almost won. When the fire shrank so small, it was no more than a cherry glow hidden under bark, when the wood was damp, when the hands were numb, when the eyes had been open too long, but the firekeeper always stayed, even when the others slept, even when the wind sang in the trees, and snapped the hides, and made the smoke burn sideways across their face, because someone had to say no, even without a voice, even with only hands and breath, someone had to hold the fire where it belonged. And the next morning, when the wind had gone, when the smoke rose soft and straight again, the others would wake and see the flame still burning. They'd say nothing, they'd just nod, and offer the firekeeper the first sip of warmed broth, the first soft word, the first silence of rest, because they all knew, when the wind tried to steal it, someone chose not to let go. The eyes that reflected flame. They said you could tell a person by the way their eyes held fire, not just how the flame lit their face, but how they looked at it. Some stared deep, like they were listening to something no one else could hear. Others blinked fast, watching the sparks like birds too quick to catch. Some tilted their heads low, eyelids heavy, letting the flicker wash over them until it became part of their breathing. And some never looked at it at all. Those were the ones to watch, because the fire had a way of pulling truth to the surface. You couldn't hide in the dark the same way you could in the day. Firelight doesn't shine straight. It dances. It wavers. It makes faces shift. Calm to strange, sharp to soft. It takes what's behind the eyes and gives it a shape on the skin. People forgot that sometimes. They thought the dark would hide them. But the fire saw. It saw the ones who watched too hard. The ones who smiled only when others looked. The ones who never told stories but always listened. Always remembering every word. And the ones who sat close. Not for warmth, not for light, but for something they couldn't name. Something they feared they'd never feel without it. That was the thing about fire. It didn't just warm the hands, it warmed everything else. Even memory, even guilt, even longing. You'd sit beside someone who never spoke much, and then in the flicker of the fifth log, they'd begin to talk. Not fast, not loud, just a slow spill, like water that had been caught too long behind a dam. They'd say names no one knew, tell stories no one asked for, share hurts no one could fix, and no one interrupted. Because when someone speaks beside flame, it's not for argument, it's not for correction, it's just to be heard. That's what the fire taught them. How to listen, not with answers, just with presence. And it showed in the eyes, a mother watching her child across the fire, her face tired but her gaze steady. A hunter looking into flame the night after their first kill, eyes wide, mouth still silent, shoulders still learning what it means to take life. An elder staring at nothing, only the movement of orange and red, remembering names that no one else living remembers. And sometimes, in those rarest moments, you caught someone looking not at the fire, but through it. Their eyes reflecting something more than color, something older than memory, something like recognition. Like the flame reminded them of a thing they once knew, but couldn't explain. A shape before language, a feeling before thought. Maybe it was the past, maybe it was the self, maybe it was something neither. Something the fire keeps only for those who look long enough. That was why the others stopped talking sometimes. Not because the story had ended, but because someone's eyes had caught the flame in a certain way, and for that moment, everyone saw it. That glint, that shadow, that echo of something not quite said, and in that silence, no one felt alone, because the flame lived in all of them, and for a moment it showed itself in the reflection, soft, flickering, unspoken, but real. What we burned just to keep warm. They didn't talk about it much. Not directly, not in daylight, but everyone in the clan had done it at some point. Watched something that wasn't meant to burn get dropped into the fire. Watched it blacken, curl, and vanish in smoke. It always started the same way. A night colder than expected, or a storm that lasted too long. Maybe they were traveling light and the wood ran out, or the wind picked up and made kindling useless. That's when people looked around differently. Not for trees, not for twigs, for anything. Something dry, something old, something they could live without, or say they could live without. A carved bowl, passed down 3 winters. A child's figure made from soft pine. A basket handle. A scrap of hide that still smelled faintly of the one who wore it. The fire didn't care what it was, it just needed to feed. And sometimes staying warm meant giving up the things you swore you never would. At first it was easy. A broken tool handle, a cracked stool. But then came the harder choices. The old cradle frame no one used anymore but still kept. The fire-dried log that once held the camp's first successful meat-drying pole. You'd stare at it in the dark, fingers numb, lips cracked and think, just this once. Just to make it through the night. And the sound it made when it caught. A pop, a hiss, the soft whine of memory turning to heat, was never loud, but it stayed with you. And the warmth felt good, yes, better than good. It felt like life coming back into the hands, into the face. But something else left with the smoke, a kind of tether, a kind of story, because what you burned was never just a thing. It was part of the path that brought you here. People started burning the sled runners during the longest winter. Not the sleds, not at first, just the runners. The long-shaped parts that had once skimmed across snow with meat and fur and laughter tied behind. When they burned, they gave off a smell like sweet wood and sour history. And when the snow finally melted, and someone asked where the runners had gone, no one answered, because they all knew. That's what it meant to make it through a hard season. Something always got left behind. The fire asked for it, quietly. Every night, it didn't demand. It invited, and people gave, not out of weakness, but out of need. There were times they burned rope, times they burned bark from the storytelling tree. One night someone dropped in the last combed braid of a woman who had died the season before. No one questioned it. No one reached into the flame to stop it, because she would have wanted them warm. That was how they justified it. That was how they always justified it. Warmth now, meaning later. Live now, mourn later. What they didn't always see though, what the fire didn't warn them about, was how easy it became. The second time, the third time, it was faster, less guilt, less memory. It was survival after all. And when survival speaks, even the most precious things begin to feel flammable. So they learned to protect what mattered most, not with stone walls or high shelves, but with rules. No burning tools unless they broke, no burning stories unless you could tell them by heart, no burning anything that had fed you. But rules bend in the cold, rules melt beside frost-bitten skin and eyes that haven't closed in days. They burned for warmth, but they lost things too. Things they didn't even realize were gone until someone asked for them and no one had an answer. They survived. Yes, the fire kept them alive, but part of being alive is remembering what it cost. And that's what they carried forward. A new kind of caution, a new kind of reverence, because the fire will always ask. And one day you'll be tempted to give it something you shouldn't. And the warmth, oh yes, the warmth will come, but so will the silence after. The story only fire could tell. They never called it a story out loud, not when others were around. It wasn't the kind of tale you told like the old hunting legends or the names of those who saw stars fall. This one wasn't spoken with rhythm, or passed from voice to voice. It was older than voice, older than telling. It was something the fire shared only in pieces, in moments, in the long space between words. It didn't start when the logs were fresh, or the flames were high. It only began when the fire had already done its job, warmed the hands, softened the night, quieted the breath. It only began when no one was trying to listen, and that was the trick of it. You couldn't look for the story, you had to sit. Still, unhurried, your body relaxed but your mind drifting, like ash carried by the wind. And if you waited like that long enough, something came through, not in language, In feeling, the story didn't begin with once or end with then. It came like a memory, only not your own, like you were remembering something older than your body, something you hadn't lived, but still somehow carried. The fire told of a time before time, not the first fire, not even the first warmth, but the first need, the first moment, something shivering and wild curled beside heat and didn't run away. That moment of stillness, that moment of surrender, that was when the story began. It told of the ones who never had fire, who learned to fear the dark and speak only when the sky was grey. It told of their voices, short, sharp, uncertain, and how they slowly began to stretch their words beside the flame. It told of the hands that stopped trembling long enough to create, to shape, to carve and paint. The fire showed how breath and warmth gave birth to ideas that could outlive the people who spoke them, and it held on to those ideas, not in smoke, not in ash, but in silence. People didn't know the fire was listening. They only saw how it moved, but its memory was deep. Every log burned was a name, every spark, a footstep, every long red line that curled across a blackened branch, that was history, written in heat. And if you looked long enough, if your mind let go just enough, you could almost read it, you could almost feel it. The story the fire never spoke, but always carried. Some nights, someone would sit too close. Not for warmth, not for comfort, just to watch, their face blank, eyes distant, unmoving, staring not at the flame, but through it. And if you asked what they saw, they'd shake their head and say nothing. But the next day, they'd be different, quieter, slower, like they'd been reminded of something they weren't supposed to forget. And that's what the fire did, if you let it. It reminded, it didn't speak in words. It just pulled something up from the deep, something older than family, older than fear, older than even love. It reminded you what it meant to be here, to survive, to wait, to witness, and to carry forward, even when you didn't know what you were carrying. That's why the elders never rushed the fire. They let it speak in its own way, let it show its story to the ones ready to see it, and they never said it was their story, because it wasn't. It belonged to the flame. And the flame, it belonged to time. The ones who slept too far from the fire, they didn't mean to sleep that far out. No one ever did, but that's how it happened. Not all at once, not as a choice, just a little too far, on a night a little too cold. Maybe someone wanted quiet. Maybe they thought the fire would last longer. Maybe they trusted their furs more than they should have. Or maybe they just didn't want to hear the snoring again. In a circle of too many bodies and too little space, sometimes the quiet beyond the glow feels like a relief, and that's how it starts. A single step back from the edge of warmth, a little more space between the flicker of light and the press of your own breath. The fire doesn't chase you. It never begs. It stays where it is, and if you step out of its reach, it lets you go. At first they slept like anyone else, just farther from the circle, a little colder, maybe, but nothing serious. They wrapped tight, pulled their cloaks over their noses, turned their backs to the wind, but the cold doesn't always come fast. Sometimes it waits, it seeps, it drifts in slowly through the gap between collar and skin, through the soles of worn leather, through the spot where your shoulder lifts just enough from the ground to let in a whisper of air. By the time they noticed, it was already there. The ones who slept too far from the fire didn't freeze all at once. It wasn't like that. It was quieter, slower. They stopped dreaming first. Then they stopped turning in their sleep. Then their breath changed, shorter, shallower, and when morning came, they didn't rise right away. Sometimes they did. Eventually, shivering, teeth clenched, angry at the cold, muttering curses that faded in the morning steam. But sometimes they didn't. Sometimes someone had to shake them, hard, had to press hands to their skin, and realize it was colder than it should have been, had to pull them closer to the fire, trying to coax warmth back into them, like it was something that could be breathed into the lungs. That was when the others learned. The fire had boundaries, not rules, not threats, just limits. It could only keep you safe if you stayed near, just close enough to feel the rhythm of its breath, to catch the pop of sap, the fall of a glowing coal, the rise of smoke against the stars. Too far, and you were on your own. Not by punishment, by nature. Fire couldn't walk after you. They started marking the edge. After that, stones, sticks, even a ring of worn boots, anything to show where the warmth ended. They told the children, stay inside the line, and when someone new came to sleep, They said it softly but firmly, closer, come closer, because the cold didn't care if you were proud, or tired, or afraid of crowds. The cold took whoever gave it room, those who came back from it, the ones who had slept too far, just once, never wandered again. They stayed close, always, sat with their backs to the coals, watched the flames longer than most. And when others drifted away, they were the ones who whispered, not too far, and their voice always carried weight, because it came from the edge. The fire didn't punish, the fire didn't judge, but it remembered who sat too far, and it never forgot to let them go. How a branch became a promise. They didn't always burn what they found right away. Some things were saved, set aside, held in hand for a moment longer than needed, and sometimes, rarely, a single branch was treated like more than wood. It started with one of the elders, though no one remembered which one. A long time ago, before the shelters were better, and the nights were harder, someone had brought back a dry limb from a dead birch. It wasn't much, no thicker than a wrist, but it was clean, light, it burned hot and bright, and quickly. They could have used it that night, but they didn't. Instead, they laid it beside the fire and said, quietly, "This is for tomorrow." That was all, and no one questioned it. The branch stayed untouched, resting on two stones like something important. No one poked it. No one fed it to the flames. And when the wind rose and the fire dimmed and the cold circled close, still, they left it alone. They burned bark, twigs, the last of the pinecone bundles, but not the branch, and somehow they made it through the night. That branch became something more than kindling. It became a marker, a reminder, a silent promise. We will see the sun again. Because to save warmth for tomorrow, even when you're cold tonight, that meant hope, not in words, not in stories, in action, in choosing to believe there would be a tomorrow, that someone would need that heat, that the future deserved a little comfort too. From then on, every fire had one, not always birch, not always dry, but always something held back, a piece of the world not given to flame yet, something to say, we expect to survive. It sat at the edge of the ring, not burned, not forgotten, just waiting. Sometimes someone new would ask, "Why don't we burn that?" And the elder closest would shake their head, soft, and say, "Because it's not for tonight." They didn't have to explain further. Over time, everyone learned. The branch became a symbol of restraint, of memory, of belief. Even on the worst nights, when the wind howled like grief, and the meat was gone, and the ground wouldn't soften for sleep, still, they kept it. And some nights, they added a second one, when a child was born, when a traveler returned, when the sick made it through another day, they would lay a second branch beside the first, and say nothing at all. The fire crackled, the sky turned, and the promise remained. Even now, even after fire became less fragile, when the clans split, and shelters were built with stone, and light could be made from flint or spark or memory, some still kept the habit, a single branch, saved. Not because they needed it, but because someone might, and that's what it meant to be part of the circle. You burned what you had to, but you always left something behind. For tomorrow, for someone cold, for someone not yet here. That's how a branch became a promise, and that's why, to this day, in the quiet places where stories are still spoken low and fires are built small, you'll sometimes find one log untouched, waiting. The night the flame died. It wasn't the first time the fire died, but it was the first time it died all the way. No coals left, no ember under bark, no hidden glow to coax back with breath and dry grass, just cold stones, dry ash, silence. The kind of silence that made the trees sound louder, like they were breathing, the kind that wrapped around the bones and said, "This is what it felt like before." No one meant for it to happen. They had done everything right, or thought they had. Wood stacked, fire ring cleared, the last feeder had placed a thick branch across the coals before sleep, same as always. But something shifted, a gust of wind, a crack in the log that split the heat too fast. Or maybe it was just the fire's time. Maybe it had burned too long without rest. They didn't notice until morning. Not right away. One of the children woke first, sat up, rubbed her arms, looked at the sky still grey with dawn. She thought something felt wrong. Then she looked at the pit and saw nothing moving. No smoke, no color, just that grey stillness that meant the fire was truly gone. She didn't scream, she didn't wake the others. She just stared, unsure what to do with the feeling in her chest. It wasn't fear. Not yet. It was something older, a quiet kind of dread, like forgetting the name of someone you love and not knowing how to get it back. When the others stirred, they gathered around the pit without speaking. Even the youngest knew this wasn't a moment for noise. They crouched low, blew gently, moved ash with a stick, hopeful for some secret coal still hiding. But there was nothing. The ground was cool. And then came the question no one wanted to ask. Who has the ember pouch? They searched the packs, the satchels, the folds of cloth, but there was no ember, no flint. The last one who carried it had traded it 2 days ago, a decision that had seemed wise at the time. There was meat, then, the fire had been strong, the night had been warm. Who would need another flame when the one they had was alive and well? Now, it was gone. They sat with that knowledge for a long time. Some stared at the horizon, others kept looking into the pit, as if staring hard enough might change something. The elder didn't speak. He just ran his fingers through the ash and closed his hand over a few grains, held it to his chest, and let it fall again. No one blamed anyone. Not out loud, but the silence was heavy. It wasn't just about cold, it was about everything the fire meant. The light in the dark, the voice between stories, the thing they'd built their rhythm around. Without it, time felt strange, distance felt wider. Even food, raw and quiet, lost its comfort. They waited, unsure what to do next, and then one of them stood. The quiet girl, the one who always watched but rarely spoke. She wrapped a fur over her shoulders, picked up a satchel, and looked to the trees. "I'll go find it." No one asked how, or where, or if she knew what she was doing. They just nodded, because someone had to. Someone always had to walk into the woods and carry hope on their back. She left before the sun fully rose. The others stayed. They didn't rebuild the fire pit. They didn't start talking again. They just sat and waited. Not for flame, but for return, because the flame might die. Yes, it did die, that night. But what mattered more was what they did after. And that wasn't over yet. What we remembered by firelight. The stories didn't always begin with a reason. Most of the time, they started like the fire itself. Small, quiet, slow to catch. Someone would shift in their seat, clear their throat, look into the flames like they were searching for something only the coals could answer. Then a voice, low, would rise up and carry a thought that hadn't been spoken in years, sometimes even decades. It was always firelight that brought them back. Not the morning sun, not the cold clarity of day. Firelight made remembering safe. It blurred the edges, made the past feel like it belonged to everyone in the circle, not just the one who lived it. The shadows on the walls, the soft sound of logs settling, the flicker of orange on fur and skin. It all gave the memory somewhere to land. And when it landed, it didn't have to be exact. No one asked for perfect truth. They just listened. Someone would talk about the old crossing, the frozen river 2 valleys east, how the ice cracked beneath their feet, how they made it anyway, how no one believed the fire could be built in that much wind. But it was, and it burned all night, and that's why we're here. Another voice might follow, remembering a song, not the whole thing, just a part, just the first few notes, hummed quietly, and others joining in, not because they remembered the words, but because they remembered how it felt. That was the power of the fire. It didn't just warm the skin, it loosened the past. Even the hard memories, especially those, they came out softer near the flame. Stories of loss, of long winters, of the ones who didn't return. Those weren't told in the daylight. Daylight made grief sharp, but by firelight, sorrow was held gently, shared in pieces, passed hand to hand like an old stone worn smooth. Even the children listened differently by firelight. They didn't fidget. They didn't interrupt. They watched the mouths of the speakers, and the way the light moved across their faces, and the way their eyes sometimes looked at the fire instead of the people. And in that way, they learned not just what happened, but how to carry a memory, how to hold it carefully, how to pass it on without breaking it. Some memories were never spoken. They were only remembered in the way someone sat closer to the flame, in the way their hands hovered near the heat, longer than needed, in the way they watched the sparks rise and disappear, and smiled, not with happiness, but with recognition, as if they saw someone in the smoke, as if a name had come to them without being said. Firelight did that. It stitched the past to the present, not in lines, but in feeling. It told no one what to say. It just waited. And when someone was ready, the fire never turned away. So much was remembered by firelight. Voices, names, the sound of wind through a certain pass, the shape of a stone hearth in a place long gone, the rhythm of a laugh that only one person still carried. And in that remembering, something stayed alive. Even after the teller was gone, even after the circle had moved on, because the fire heard it too. And fire remembers, not in the way people do, but in warmth, in smoke, in silence, and every time it's lit again, something old returns with it. Why you still need it? Even now, we don't gather around it the same way anymore. Most of us don't need it to stay alive. Our rooms are warm, our food is cooked by wires and buttons, our nights are lit by soft bulbs, and the dark doesn't reach as far as it used to. But still, when a fire burns, we watch it, quietly, like something ancient is moving inside us, and we don't want to scare it away. You still need it, even now, not because your fingers will freeze without it, but because something deeper remembers what fire meant before you had words for warmth. Even now, when a storm hits and the lights go out, what's the first thing you look for? A match, a candle, a flicker, not just for light, for reassurance, for the steady sound of something burning just enough to remind you that you're still here, that you're not alone, that you haven't drifted too far from the people who first taught you how to survive. Fire made the night safe, not just with heat or light, but with presence, with sound. It gave shape to fear, and turned it into something you could sit beside, that hasn't changed. You may not sleep under stars anymore, but the part of you that listens for crackling branches, that watches the flame curl upward and vanish into dark, that part hasn't gone anywhere. It's just waiting. And when you light a fire, in your hearth, or in a circle of stones, that part of you steps forward again, quietly, without announcement. It remembers, because it's not about the flame itself, it's about what it carried: company, memory, forgiveness, the warmth of another body, sitting just close enough to hear you breathe. You still need that. Not because the world is cold, but because you are, sometimes, in ways fire still knows how to answer. And fire doesn't judge, it doesn't ask questions, it just waits, it offers, it reminds. That's why people stare into it longer than they mean to. Why even in silence, no one feels alone when a flame is near. Why stories come more easily, and thoughts come slower, and tears, if they fall, do so softly, warmed on the way down. You still need it. Even if you never strike another match again, even if the fire lives only behind your eyes, because fire in the end is just a way of holding on to something we never wanted to lose. Not light, not heat, but each other. And with that, the flame lowers, not out, not lost, just resting. I'm here, if you ever want to return to the circle, to begin again, or to remember. Ask ChatGPT,